Welcome. We are so lucky today to have Shannon on. We're going to be talking all about creatine. I want to introduce you to my now good friend and fellow scientist, lover of all things athletic / science, sports nutrition related, Shannon O'Grady from Gnarly Nutrition. Shannon, thank you for being on today.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. Yeah, Elizabeth and I mean, friends at first email and had some good nerding out sessions on nutrition. So I'm happy to be in front of this community. I'm also happy to have met you, a fellow nutrition nerd. So
we're starting a book club in case anyone's interested. We've decided. Let's just do a little, how long you've been with Gnarly and just a little bit of your background.
Sure. I've been with Gnarly for about 7 years. I started out in kind of academia, got my doctorate in nutritional physiology with more of a bend on kind of ecological questions. So looking at morphological and physiological adaptations to different diets in animals. About that time, discovered triathlon and ultra running and a little ultra biking and all of the above, and quickly realized the importance of nutrition in finishing anything endurance related, and saw a lot of overlap between what I was studying and where my passion lied, and wanted to stay in Utah. So switched over to the supplement industry, did some work kind of on quality control and quality measures. So bringing supplement companies into FDA compliance and getting them NSF certified, and along that that path found Gnarly Nutrition, and have been there ever since. It's been great.
That's awesome. That's such a fun getting to, I think we've talked about this, do what we love with something that we love, like be able to combine our passions and our work is always such a neat thing.
Yeah, it's the ideal, right?
Yes, it really is. All right, I'm going to start sharing my screen here. Let's do this. All right. So all things creatine today, as usual. If you guys want to ask questions throughout, you can put them in the chat, raise your hand, speak up. This is going to be as conversational as possible. So today we're going to go over really kind of creatine 101, what it is, what the best form is that you want to look for, the formulation, how to take it, when to take it, why you want to take creatine, and then some of the side effects, positive and negative, and kind of the discussion around what creatine is and isn't, some of the myths. I would love if you want to type in the chat maybe anything you've heard about creatine or what you think you know. It'd be fun to see at the end how that changes, or we can go back and look at some of those and answer some of those questions as well. All right, just to kick it off, a favorite, I think anytime creatine is mentioned, and kind of the reason that I said like it's not just for gym bros, is at least my generation and older, around my generation, creatine was something that like only bodybuilders did and used, and it was just not talked about. And was it like a steroid? Was it this? And so there's always some misinformation, and I think people are often assume that either there's not studies behind it, or the things that we're talking about haven't been researched. And just this quote to really kind of seal it home is there's probably more data on creatine monohydrate than any other supplement in existence. And I would, Shannon's shaking her head. You concur?
I concur. I think it's also to dive into that data. There's more safety data. There's more data on, the impact it can have for athletes on power and strength exercise. And there's more and more data, which we'll talk about in a minute, coming out on some of these other kind of lesser known benefits that are really interesting.
Yeah. And I think too, the longevity of, because this supplement has been around for so long, we have that ability to look at it's not just a trend. We've seen it longitudinally, how it like can affect people and impact their training and racing.
Shannon, on that quote, would you say probably more data, or there is that it does have the most data and then any other supplement outside of, say, carbohydrates or water?
Or protein. Yeah, I'd say in terms of supplements that might have an ergogenic benefit, definitely more data.
Yeah.
And in case anyone hasn't heard Scott and I talk about it, what ergogenic benefit for athletes, what does that mean?
So a positive benefit on performance, on potentially even endurance. It's going to have a positive impact on the exercise or the training that you're doing.
Perfect. So because of science, like I love seeing the chemical formulation of things, but creatine, again, is there a simple way, like, is there the conversational way to describe what creatine is if someone asked you, like, in an elevator?
Yeah, so this is my cat. Creatine is a beta amino acid, meaning it's a non-protein amino acid. So it has many similarities as far as chemical structure to the amino acids that we're more familiar with, but you don't find it in proteins. It's actually made from other amino acids. So I typically, tell people, like, it's an amino acid, much like, you might be familiar with, proteins being made of amino acids. A lot of people think it's a steroid or synthetic. So I think associating that, to something they know is a good way to start.
And I know that, so our bodies use it. It's mainly in our muscles and our brain, primarily made in the liver and kidneys, pancreas. Like, how does our body make creatine? Do we have to, is it just from foods that we ingest?
Yeah, great question. So creatine can both be synthesized and be, extracted or, gotten. That's not the right word, but we can get it from the foods that we eat. So it's synthesized from 3 amino acids, methionine, glycine, and arginine in the liver, and to lesser extent in the kidneys and pancreas. It can also be synthesized in the brain, actually. And it does cross the blood-brain barrier, but we need to take in higher amounts, even more than typical supplementation, in order to get brain concentrations of creatine up. But we get it from foods like meat and fish. And so typically, if you look at creatine levels in individuals that consume meat and fish versus vegans and vegetarians, you see higher baseline levels of creatine in the muscles of those that consume meat. And therefore, vegans and vegetarians may benefit from supplementation even more than omnivorous individuals, which I think is a really interesting point that a lot of people may not be aware of.
So the product itself, because I know when we talk about vegetarians and vegans or plant-based athletes, unlike a protein powder, say, that could be a whey or casein, creatine isn't animal or plant-based specifically, even though we get it when we eat animals. So it's not like vegans or vegetarians can take creatine.
Great question. Yes, it's not sourced from any animal-based material. It's chemically synthesized. And so creatine that you find as a supplement on, shelves of stores or websites is vegan just by nature of how it's made.
Great. So when we're looking at it, like, in the body, I know we're going to talk about in terms of performance, what it does, but what is its, I guess, primary function, if you will, in the body?
Sure. So creatine is stored in our muscles as phosphocreatine. And I often, like to think about it. It's really that phosphate molecule that is the most helpful part. It kind of is a storage molecule for extra phosphates. So we have small stores of ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, which is the main energy currency of the body in our muscles, but really not much in terms of storage to contribute substantially to energy production when we're doing exercise. Our next fastest way to produce ATP is by using phosphocreatine and donating that phosphate molecule to ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate, to make ATP. Creatine kinase is the enzyme that helps catalyze that reaction. And when we supplement our phosphocreatine stores to a saturated state, or to, you can think of 100% full, that ATP generation can go from about 5 to 8 seconds to 8 to 12 seconds. And that doesn't seem like a huge difference, but we have all that data, right? Most studied supplement out there, and it's consistently shown to translate to a 15 to 20% increase in measures of strength, power, and sprinting.
Which is a significant difference for
Huge. I mean, I often am like, one of the best measures of that, or most studied measures of that is just, a simple max lift, Olympic lift. If you can increase your max lift by 20%, that's a pretty substantial increase. And then you think of, it's not just getting that number, right? What are the downstream implications of being able to lift more weight? That's increased muscle mass. For endurance athletes who may not necessarily be focused on the gains in strength acutely, we can look at it as contributing to longevity and a decreased likelihood of getting injured, right? So even, we're going to get to some more specific benefits that endurance athletes might be more interested in. But if we look at what creatine is best known for, it can really help support a longer and healthier career kind of in an endurance sport specifically.
Which I pretty much know everybody on this call, and they would all say that's something that they want, hands down.
And Shannon, on that point, I think it is something that we do talk about, because I get this question about creatine. It's always about strength, power, and improving that and sprint performance. But I think what is often forgotten is that strength and power is still something that endurance athletes will benefit from. And if they can do more repetitions and lift more weight and produce more strength, then ultimately over time, that's going to be a benefit. And I think it sometimes just gets lost in translation that they think, oh, that immediate versus what is that immediate going to do in the chronic?
Exactly.
And it's so important to hear you say that, because everyone's like, oh, it's no good for endurance athletes. And it's like, how can you say that? Because you will see benefits over time from improvements in strength, power, as you say, retention of lean muscle mass and whatnot. Like, that's what everyone wants. So
exactly. Yeah. And I think even in the event itself, like if we look at biking specifically, I mean, there's a reason why we use power meters, right? It's because power is important. Power generation is what gets us up steep hills. Like it's not because it's an endurance sport. It doesn't mean that strength and power aren't part of the equation.
Exactly. And I know, like, N of one experiment, I don't think directly that like I started taking creatine and the next day I had significantly more power on the bike. But I started taking creatine consistently, and I was able to lift more in the gym and train harder and climb hills faster. And, eventually my power was like leaps and bounds better than it was before. And so it's downstream, like you said.
And I'm glad you bring that up, Elizabeth, because it's something that I forgot to mention, right? So we talked about differences between vegetarians and vegans and omnivores, but it's good to know what that baseline looks like. So someone that consumes meat or fish and, pretty regularly has a basic omnivorous diet, their natural creatine stores, both from food and from the contribution of creatine synthesis in their bodies, it's going to be about 60%. Studies have shown that vegans and vegetarians are going to be about 40%, of full stores. And so that's where the difference between, vegans and vegetarians potentially being super responders because their baseline levels are lower. But it takes time to go from that 40% or from that 60% to 100%. And that's where, which we'll talk about in a minute, the different dosing strategies come into play, how quickly you want to see results, and therefore what your supplementation regimen should look like.
Excellent transition as we are, that's exactly right. I thought this was kind of a funny, and hopefully you guys have some, if you want to chime in, some like creatine myths and truths, if you will, to kind of clear up some of the, like, I don't know, all of the weird things that we've heard. I've heard a ton of weird things. So creatine is a drug or a steroid. No, we've kind of established that. And this one I get a lot from endurance athletes. Creatine makes you retain a ton of water and isn't good when trying to lose weight. Do you want to address like why people think that? And is it really, I know there's been some new research showing that it's not quite what we thought it was in terms of water retention. And
yeah, this is an interesting one. So creatine, similar to glycogen or the storage form of carbohydrate in our body, is stored with water. So it is true that you may see an increase in water weight in your body. I think it's important to deconstruct the phrase lose weight because, right, we can change body composition and get more lean body mass and lose fat mass. And maybe that change, the change in the number on the scale isn't substantial, but we're still seeing, an impact where we want to see it. Also, long-term studies have shown that, and this is like not just 4 weeks of creatine supplementation, but kind of on the order of maybe 8 to 10 weeks, that you do see an equilibration of total body water measurements between groups that are supplementing with creatine and in studies when we compare them to placebo groups who aren't taking creatine. So it seems there may be some kind of evening out. And although you might initially experience a little bit of water gain, you might not see it down the road if you stay supplementing with creatine. I would also point out that one of the benefits that might be great for endurance athletes in terms of creatine is being in this hyperhydration state. So storing more water, it can help with heat tolerance. There have been studies looking at performance in high heat on those supplementing with creatine versus those not. And we see a maintenance of performance in those supplementing with creatine and lower measurements of heat stroke, not heat stroke, but heat related
heat exhaustion.
Exactly, heat exhaustion. So even if you are storing a little bit more water, it might actually be a positive if you're going to be racing in conditions where heat and humidity are an issue.
Perfect. Thank you.
Can I ask a question on that, Shannon? Because I was talking to someone in Europe the other day about this, and they were saying, a researcher from England was saying that the fluid benefits of creatine don't impact hydration status per se and don't provide an ergogenic effect. And I was like, no, there's definitely been some research showing ergogenic effect. And he was saying that this professor in England was saying that it's intracellular water versus extracellular fluid, and that the intracellular fluid doesn't cross over into extracellular fluid. Sorry, I'm getting maybe losing some athletes here, and that doesn't actually impact total body water and therefore doesn't impact hydration status. But I actually said, I think that's bullshit. Would that be correct in saying that or not?
I'd be on the bullshit side as well. I mean, I have a hard time imagining that the intracellular water wouldn't cross over to extracellular water.
Yeah, I mean, there's a gradient. It's like, yeah. Okay, I'll find out who that professor was and try and get them on.
there are plenty of studies showing, at least right? There are mechanistic studies, and then there are studies looking at the actual, impact of creatine supplementation and environmental factors. So there are a lot of studies showing this improved heat tolerance. And then there are, studies showing this hyperhydration state. Those two have not been, connected as clearly as I'd like to see, because at the same time, right, if we see some kind of equilibration in body water, then you would imagine that hyperhydration benefit might go away. So I'm curious to know, if we see less of a benefit in terms of heat tolerance the longer someone is on creatine and you see an equilibration of total body water, or maybe it's another mechanism entirely.
Would you be able to, obviously at the end of this, it'd be really good just to post talk, like share references that we do sort of refer to in this related to, things like hydration status and stuff. And I think it'd be just good to share with athletes who do have sort of further reading sort of interest around the topic. So that'd be cool.
I've got a good folder of creatine articles that I think.
Yeah, we can put them in the YouTube when we post it on YouTube as well, and just have the references there.
Okay, sounds good.
Cool. Okay, cool. Sorry. Keep going, Elizabeth. Sorry, I digress.
No. This is what makes it an interesting conversation. These next couple will just kind of like bullet point go through. Do you need to cycle creatine, or do you have to cycle creatine and go through a loading phase?
Nope, you don't. I mean, the loading phase gets back to trying to get to that full or 100% storage more quickly. And so loading is simply taking a higher dose of creatine for a short period of time to get to that level faster. You can start on a maintenance dose and you will still get to that saturated level. It just takes more time. It's like if you load, it takes about a week. If you start on a maintenance dose, it takes about 3 to 4 weeks.
Does it harm your liver and kidneys, make your hair fall out? Is it going to do like long-term health damage? No.
Yeah, there were early on, there were some studies that kind of started this idea that it could cause kidney damage. They have done studies in healthy populations. They've even done studies in people with underlying kidney issues, and creatine is safe. It does not have any bad effect on your kidneys. You will see an increase in creatinine, which is a metabolic byproduct. And it's that increase in creatinine that many interpret as being a sign that you're having it's having a detrimental effect on kidney function. But you're getting that increase in creatinine simply because you're increasing your creatine intake. So important to separate those two.
Thank you. Yes. Especially since
can you please say that again so every GP can hear that?
Yeah.
Please, because it is the most common thing I hear from either a doctor talking about my own creatinine levels or an athlete's levels, and they're like, you're in kidney failure because your creatinine levels are up.
Yeah, it's.
Could you just please say that once more for me? Because I'm going to
use it as a clip.
I'm going to take a sound bite. I'm going to take a sound bite so that I can put that on social media, if you don't mind.
Sure. So when supplementing with creatine, you will see an increase in creatinine levels simply because creatinine is a metabolic byproduct of increased creatine intake. Increased creatinine is not a definitive measure of kidney dysfunction or having a negative impact on kidney function in and of itself. So I think it's important, if you are treating an athlete that has increased creatinine levels, to talk to them about their supplementation before jumping down, the path that there's an inherent issue with kidney function.
I'm just going to applaud that. Thank you very much. That was very much appreciated. I almost can't believe I'm going to say this out loud, but is creatine just for men?
No, and hopefully we'll have some time to talk about some specific reasons why women should take creatine, because there definitely are. sadly, more women need to be in sports nutrition studies, more women need to be in creatine specific studies, but we're starting to look at the impact of individual hormones, and especially as they cycle with menstruation, not just on creatine synthesis, but also in the case of where we see elevated levels of protein catabolism because of high levels of estrogen, where creatine could be especially beneficial. And then in postmenopausal women who are, at higher risk for osteoporosis, where maintaining muscle mass and something like creatine could be beneficial for bone health.
Amen. Amen to that. I think they should start passing that around at all mammogram appointments or something, just to remind women how important it is and that they should be taking it. And then the last one, creatine is best for serious lifters, not for endurance athletes or.
Yeah, I think, and we'll talk about some of the lesser known benefits, but we already talked about why strength is important for endurance athletes as well, for everyone, actually. I think longevity is really tied to our ability to keep moving as we age. And the ability to keep moving is tied to our muscle mass and it gets harder to not just maintain, but put on more muscle as we age. So anything that can help us is going to be a great thing for quality of life.
Excellent.
Shannon, sorry, just jump in again. One question. I have seen studies though where the ingestion of creatine either at a cycle or a maintenance dose without the stimulus of muscle growth, i.e. resistance training or exercise, has very little effect from a myocentric or muscle perspective. Is that, we still stand by that? Taking creatine on its own will not suddenly make you superhuman in the Hulk, and even it won't, even if you're lifting weights, but you have to lift weights or do exercise in order for it to have those muscle benefits. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, cool. That's all right. So people don't think they're suddenly going to get big muscles just by taking 5 grams a day.
Yeah,
I wish that was the case, but just unfortunately it doesn't happen. So
we're always looking for that magic bullet.
Yeah.
Although, kind of to that point, a funny thing. So I have my 80-year-old dad and my 76-year-old mom on creatine. They've been on it for a while. And when my dad first started taking it, he's like, great. He's like, now I'm just really going to get some of these muscles back. And I'm like, no, Dad, you got to go to the gym. It's not like the magic, but it's funny that it's perfectly timed. He was so excited. And my mom goes, wait, am I going to get big muscles? I've never had big muscles. And yeah, just the perfect conversation. All right. So talking, and this is where I would really like to dig in, best forms of creatine, and then specifically from your product development round, how do you even formulate and make, and how does the creatine powder get in that gnarly creatine bag? What's involved?
Yeah. Well, so creatine, I want to address what you have on the slide first, because I think it's an important point, because, creatine monohydrate does have the most evidence behind it. It's also the best absorbed form of creatine. It's also the cheapest form of creatine. So there are other, there are supplement companies touting other forms of creatine. You just need a creatine monohydrate. In this case, creatine is a pretty simple product for us to manufacture because it comes as creatine monohydrate. We don't add anything to our creatine because we want people to be able to use it in products that they like, regulate the macronutrients that go with it, regulate other actives that they want. It's unflavored. It dissolves pretty well in solution. Usually when I'm taking my creatine, I'll fill up my water bottle and then maybe have to fill it again just to make sure it dissolves all the way. Our creatine is NSF for sport certified, which means that it goes through all the content testing that NSF does. It tests for all label claims, tests for contaminants like heavy metals, pesticides, and microbes. And And then it also goes through a toxicology review by NSF, and then the NSF for sports certification tests the product also for all substances on the World Anti-Doping Agency banned substances list. So you can find cheaper versions of creatine monohydrate. Ours is a little bit more expensive because of that testing, which we feel is really important, because a lot of supplement companies sadly have given the industry a bad name for contamination and also for not having in their products what the label says should be in there. As far as how to take, once again, it really matters how quickly you would like to see results. So I think for most of us that don't necessarily have an event coming up in a week where we are trying to max our deadlift out or anything like that, we don't necessarily have to do a loading phase. A loading phase is typically 20 grams per day. It's 0.3 grams per kilogram if you want to get really specific about it. And that 20 grams is often broken. It's suggested to break it up into 4 5-gram doses separated by a few hours. That will help with tolerance. So creatine at a dose of 5 grams will probably not cause GI issues, but creatine at a dose of 20 grams in one sitting is likely to cause GI issues. So if you do want to load, I recommend dividing that dose over the course of the day. If you, like me and Elizabeth, don't have any time constraints we're acting against and just over time want to see a benefit, then I recommend just taking 5 grams a day.
And then you mentioned like to full saturation can take 3 to 4 weeks. In terms of, I get a lot of athletes asking, like, does it matter? Do I take it before, during, after? Is it going to make much of a difference in my strength training session? So
the impact of creatine is not acute. So you won't see, like, when you take creatine, it's not necessarily going to have an impact on the exercise you're about to do. It's more of a long-term impact because you need to build to saturation levels. So once you do, you are at a saturated state, you will see a benefit no matter when you take creatine over the course of the day relative to when you're training. I will say that there's some interesting research looking at taking creatine with carbohydrate and taking creatine with carbohydrate and protein, and both taking with carbs or protein increase creatine absorption. But then important for endurance athletes is that it also increased glycogen repletion. So got your stores of glycogen back to where they were before, your endurance exercise. So in that case, that's a great thing to take after for that benefit in and of itself. And so taking creatine maybe with your protein and carbs that you would take as a recovery meal or shake, whatever you choose to do, can help you get your glycogen stores back where they should be, which can help with recovery and subsequent performance.
How much quicker are we talking? I mean, we do recommend taking creatine in their post-workout shake, although again, like if they don't do that, it's not like end of the world, but it's nice to hear that's sort of what we're doing. But how much quicker is glycogen replenishment? Because for some athletes, they're doing either back-to-back training in the same day and certainly doing training most days of the week. Like, are we talking it can increase like within 24 hours? Are we seeing a significant improvement? Or?
I'm going to have to get back to you on that one, Scott.
Okay.
Yeah,
cool.
I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Don't want to put you on this one. A couple of things, Shannon, you just mentioned. So you, in terms of how is it actually synthetically made? Like you said, like you don't add anything to it, but how is it actually made? I've searched and searched and searched, like for how it's made, but no one seems to deliver. Like, is that a secret recipe or something? Like, or are you just making it from methionine and arginine and all the glycine?
That's also something I'll have to get back to you on, but I can definitely, what I will be able to tell you is what the starting material is. So we use Creapure, which is a branded creatine out of Germany. It's one of the highest quality creatines just in terms of the conditions that it's produced in, and in terms of the safety testing that's been done on it. And I'm sure I can tell you what the starting material is, but I'm sure the chemical synthesis might be proprietary. But I'll go look at our sourcing documents and I can.
But and I've been loading questions in there. Creapure is a form of creatine monohydrate, though, isn't it?
Yes. Yep.
So are you doing something to the Creapure?
No.
No. So you just take Creapure and just put it in a bag.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Because that's the same as, say, Gnarly, True. I think Momentous uses Creapure as well. And it's good to hear that. I was going to ask the question between who Momentous did.
Yeah, they used to have Creapure in their product, much like many things during the pandemic. There has been a shortage of creatine. There was a shortage of Creapure. Specifically, the price, whenever there's a shortage of anything, the price goes up 3 times. Well, specific to creatine, it went up 3 times the cost. So we decided to stick with Creapure, and we actually increased the cost of our product. We took on some of it and passed some of it on to our customers. When I looked at Momentous's product a couple weeks ago, they were no longer saying Creapure on the supplement facts. It was just creatine monohydrate. So, I mean, I'm not saying that that's a negative thing. It's still NSF tested. I think they do a good job with supplements, but I don't believe that it's Creapure any longer.
Yeah, interesting. So yeah, True and Gnarly then are using Creapure, and that's, from my understanding, is it's the best form of creatine in the world. So what's that based on? I don't know. What's the difference between, I guess the question is, what's the difference between Creapure and other creatine monohydrate?
A lot of it is the cleanliness of the manufacturing facility, the testing record, both put out by Alzchem, which is the company that manufactures creatine, but also its use in scientific studies. So for us, if we're going to send something to be NSF tested, which is not a cheap process,
you want to make sure.
You want to know going into it, it's going to pass. Yeah,
no, that makes sense. Yeah, that's cool. That's interesting. I did hear something the other day that, and I don't know if he was blowing his own horn, but Huberman was talking about it. They were talking about how they've talked about creatine a lot, and they've seen this spike in price of creatine as a result. And there's been attributions to saying that because his show is like one of the most listened to on the planet, it could be pushing up the price of creatine. So
could also be pushing up his ego.
Well, I think it could be doing that as well, but anyway. But I think the shortage,
I think 3 times the price. So and Creapure last year was booked out 12 months in advance supply wise. So there is,
I put it down more to COVID than his podcast. But anyway, I thought I'd just throw that out there.
I'd say that as well.
And I just want to point out, when we're talking about cost, like $55 for a 3-month supply is still incredibly affordable based on, I'm sure people on this call or people that we know that has spent $55 in a week at Starbucks grabbing, the drink or whatever. Like, it is, even at a raised cost, it's the most affordable supplement I own, and that has the greatest impact. Like, it's the highest return on investment, money well spent.
We bought 5 cans of Liquid Death in Austin, and that cost $75. So, and that was canned water. So I don't know about you, but there's something wrong with when canned water costs $15.
That's insane.
Yeah. So creatine is very cheap in that respect.
All right, now in digging into some of the benefits, and again, really not side effects. We've often touched on a couple. I put the brain health, traumatic brain injury, cognition, aging one at the top, specifically because I want to highlight its importance outside of endurance sports and really the impact for all of us, for all the people that we know. can we talk a little bit about how it's actually potentially helping our brain and what we're learning? We're still in the new phases of learning a lot about it.
Yeah, I'd say the most promising research, you have it under a different bullet, but I'd say the most promising research that I've seen relative to the brain is with depression and PTSD. And I just say that because most of the studies are in humans, whereas the TBI and cognition research is very animal study heavy with some more, human studies coming out. But there's research showing, so creatine helps with brain energetics, and a lot of mental health disorders like depression, like PTSD, are issues with brain energetics. And so that's where there was also some correlation between people with depressive symptoms and creatine levels. And I think that's where the interest started. So there's been studies showing that creatine supplementation can reduce depressive symptoms. There've been studies showing that creatine supplementation in coordinates with antidepressants can potentially reduce the level of antidepressants needed to achieve the same benefit. So definitely not suggesting anyone should come off of their antidepressants just because they're on creatine. That's something you should, work with your healthcare practitioners on, but it is promising research and similar studies with the PTSD as far as anxiety levels. The traumatic brain injury, things like concussions, there's a lot of research in animals showing that it can minimize the impact of traumatic brain injury and enhance the recovery. There's one study that I've seen, interestingly, in children backing up that animal research. But like I said, I feel like more studies need to be done in humans before we can conclusively say that. But given the research in depression and PTSD, it's promising. And then there's some studies showing that it can, in the face of stress, so I think the stressor was sleep deprivation, it can help with brain function and cognition. It can help with short-term memory loss. I think there's studies in looking at brain function in aging adults, and creatine supplementation helped with that as well. So definitely all good things. And given it's such a low risk and that it's such a safe supplement, like it definitely is something that should be added in simply for those reasons.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. Increased high intensity exercise performance. And I'm going to kind of cover, but like reduced muscle damage, inflammation, soreness. How does it help with those or that kind of potentially endurance athlete benefit?
Yeah, so we talked about the high intensity exercise performance a little bit. As a consequence of kind of that phosphate donor to ADP, creation of ATP, creatine is also a natural intramuscular buffer. So anaerobic metabolism sets in when we're operating at higher intensity heart rates, when we can't get in as much oxygen as our body requires to produce the energy needed for what we're doing at a given time. And a byproduct of anaerobic metabolism is hydrogen ions. So I'm sure you guys have covered this in the past, but every time I see lactic acid, I'm like, oh, it's not lactic acid. We get hydrogen, we get lactate, we get pyruvate. Lactate can actually be shuttled, can be a source of energy in and of itself. The increase in acidity that we see in muscles is due to that production of hydrogen ions. And so any buffer is something that doesn't totally, take care of that rise in acidity, but it minimizes it. And so creatine, being an intramuscular buffer, can slow that rise in acidity. And that rise in acidity is connected to muscular failure. And so by blunting that, we have a positive impact on endurance. So that's also a benefit specific to high intensity performance. There's studies, I think, in marathon runners after a 30K run looking at inflammation, markers of inflammation, and showing that those supplementing with creatine had lower levels of these markers relative to those not supplementing. So there's some good research supporting its benefit, not just in, strength and power.
Yeah. So we covered a little bit muscle growth and lean body mass. The heat tolerance, was there anything else we wanted to highlight? I think we covered it.
Yeah. No, I'll share the article I'm thinking of that talks, a section specifically on that. We can try to dissect what that is relative to the intracellular, extracellular water storage.
Perfect. And then not on this, but I want to make sure we have time for it. So some of the benefits we're seeing female specific in terms of during the menstrual cycle and as well as in menopause. Again, I want to just.
Yeah, so during the luteal phase, which is the high estrogen phase, you see an increase in protein catabolism. And so, whenever we're breaking down muscle, it's never a good thing, both in terms of recovery, in terms of performance. And so anything that we can take to offset that is going to be a good thing. And so, it would be hard to take creatine specific to that cycle or to that portion of your cycle. But in general, if supplementing with creatine, it will help reduce kind of the negative impact of that high estrogen phase.
Perfect. And then injury prevention and injury recovery. How can it help with both of those?
Yeah, so the injury recovery is simply related to that increased muscle growth. So as Scott was saying earlier, we're not just taking creatine by itself and we see this benefit, right? It's in conjunction with strength, or in this case, rehab exercises. And so it's going to minimize the muscle wasting that we might see because we're not moving around as much. And that's where that improved recovery relative to injury comes in. The injury prevention, that is based on studies they've done. And I think most of the studies I've seen are with team sports. So either collegiate or pro team sports. I've seen some studies in soccer, basketball, and football where they've taken teams and divided them into those supplementing with creatine and those not. And they see, it's been in at least 4 studies, a decrease in injury in those supplementing with creatine. Haven't seen connection to an actual mechanism, but I would imagine potentially it might have something to do with that hyperhydration state, because musculoskeletal tissues really need to be, you need to be well hydrated in order for them to function properly. And whenever we're dehydrated, that's when we're potentially more prone to tendon and ligament injuries. So there might be a connection there, but I don't really know. That's just me guessing.
Yes.
Last question. Sorry, another question from me. You mentioned about injury recovery. Now, I did see some studies early on where people were taking creatine pre-ACL surgery and it didn't necessarily have a positive outcome on muscle growth. Has there been anything since with blood flow restriction and taking creatine prior to, say, major orthopedic surgery and seeing improvements in, say, muscle mass retention or improvements in recovery?
That's a great question. And I haven't seen studies specific to blood flow restriction, but I also haven't actively looked, Scott, so they could be out there. And it would make sense. So for those that might not be familiar with blood flow restriction, right, it's a way to get potentially the same adaptive benefit that you would experience from lifting higher weights with lower weights because you're restricting blood flow to a specific part of the body. And so it would make sense when recovering from an injury that in conjunction with creatine could be beneficial. But I haven't seen it. That doesn't mean that it's not out there.
And I guess following up from that, just thinking of postmenopausal women and older gentlemen, has there been any studies with blood flow restriction, either supplementing with creatine or without creatine, and seeing improvements in, say, outcomes for strength and power and muscle growth?
Haven't seen it specific to blood flow restriction. It's something that I have seen a lot in friends that are climbers that use blood flow restriction a lot for training, but as something that I've researched or
Yeah.
learned about, I don't know a ton about it.
Yeah, because I think the blood flow restriction is fascinating. The potentials for it, especially for older athletes who potentially have either damaged joints or maybe not the best mechanics, and then still able to apply a minimal load but still get that maximal growth. It is interesting. I can imagine creatine would have a positive impact on it, but I guess that's a hypothetical.
Yeah, I'm interested and I'm going to look for it. So I'll tell you what.
Good study for any PhD researcher out there. So.
I almost feel like at this point, is there anything creatine isn't good for? I mean, we've covered so many benefits of creatine. Why not throw it on the list? This probably, and this, I just wanted to flashback as we're talking about injury recovery from one of our webinars last year that we did. Taking creatine alone isn't specifically going to heal your injuries faster, but on the protocol that we had and suggested that Scott and I had talked about last year, it's very much a piece of the puzzle when you're trying to look at how to come back from an injury safely and potentially at a faster rate than you would have been before. Also, Gnarly has many of those supplements, like the D and the collagen. You're a full service.
We try to be. I mean, if there's good research behind something's efficacy, we try to make it.
All right. So some key takeaways. I just wanted to make sure that anyone and everyone, athlete, triathlete, strength trainer, golfer, any age can all benefit from creatine. If we are not doing the loading phase, 5 grams a day of creatine monohydrate. Consistency matters because we have to fully saturate. And then again, too many to list, but performance, lean body mass, brain health, preventing depression, PTSD, injury repair, heat tolerance, on and on. If we do a closing, like an ode to creatine, Shannon, do you have a thought on it in general? I know it's on both of our list of non-negotiables that we take all the time, no matter what.
Yeah, I mean, I think beyond, early on getting a bad name because of this connection with, kidney dysfunction, which is not true. I think a lot of people also get this idea that it's going to lead to bulking up. And I think it's important to note that, creatine helps you really adapt to the stimulus that you're giving it. So in order to bulk up, you need tons of calories. It's not as easy as just taking creatine. So if you're giving it stimulus that fits in kind of an endurance athlete and you're doing cross training for health and longevity and injury prevention, bulking up is not something that you should be worried about. And I have heard doctors say that they think everyone should be on 3 to 5 grams of creatine for their entire, lifetime, including children. And there have been many studies done in adolescents as well. So it's very safe, and I can only think of positives. So give it a try and see what you think.
Perfect. Just quickly on children, would you, the 5 grams a day still? Because I know we talked about for loading, there's that 0.3 grams per, would you do less for children?
I would do less, and I would I don't have my kids on it. I think if there are, nowadays very high performing children that are, at a high athletic level, training a lot, where recovery and injuries, are a concern. And I think in those cases, it makes sense. I think just making sure your kids have a balanced diet is a good thing to start with. And we don't need to, get them started on a creatine protocol just yet, but.
Perfect. All right. I'm going to open it up. Questions. I know that there's a ton. Before I start onto those, if anyone wants to turn on their mic and camera, I'm going to give you first dibs because I love it when people speak up and ask questions.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Could you just go over the loading, what's the benefit of loading and when before an event, you would do it?
Yeah, so the benefit of loading is simply getting your creatine stores to that saturation level more quickly. It takes about 7 days versus if you were just taking a maintenance dose, which is 5 grams, it would take about 3 to 4 weeks. So it's really, if you have an event that you're hoping to benefit from creatine, during, then if you're a week out, you would potentially do the loading phase. I will say that a week out of an endurance event, I still wouldn't necessarily add anything new. I think, I would say if you want to try creatine, you should try it, farther out from your race and start slowly to make sure you tolerate it, to make sure you like the impact. Because I would hate for you to add something in and then somehow have a negative impact. And, so the nothing new on race day is the nothing new on race week for me.
And that's something that we talk about a lot. Like, you don't introduce something on race week. So certainly, like you're training your carbs, like you're training your fluids, all that sort of stuff in training, start taking your creatine earlier. What would be the minimum duration out from a major event you would consider starting it?
I am a big fan of just the maintenance dose. And so, 4 weeks out would give you enough time to get to saturation and to start seeing benefits that you could hope to experience during your race itself.
Cool. Hey,
sorry,
Shannon, go on.
I was just going to say, on the other end too, at Gnarly, we work with a lot of climbers as well. And we have some climbers that like to stay on creatine even when they're, trying something hard or attempting a project or competing. We have other athletes that only like to be on creatine during strength phases, and then they like to come off of it when they're, about to try something hard or competing. And so it's important to know also the amount of time that it takes you to get back to those baseline levels. And it intuitively is that same amount of time it takes you to build up. So it takes about 3 to 4 weeks to get back to where you were prior to supplementation.
And I think Brett's question plays off really well with this. He said, if you take it as a supplement, will my body adapt by producing less on its own?
I have not seen research supporting that. So the 5 grams per day has been used in studies up to 3 years. And those participants in those studies are still at saturation level. You would expect, if you would see a decrease in endogenous synthesis, that it would require more creatine in terms of a supplement to then keep you at saturation, right? Because if you saw a decrease in the amount your body would making, you'd have to take in even more to stay at the same level. And that's not what you're seeing.
Thank you. That answers the question. Appreciate it.
Perfect. I think we've answered the next two from Marta E. So difference between creatine and creatinine, that was answered. Bad rap for creatine, we've covered that. It doesn't have one, or it shouldn't have one. Thank you, Cindy, for your point. I think that's well made. I had a heap of questions. Some of these have been answered. Can we do a test to actually measure your intramuscular stores? So, like, is there a blood test, or does it have to be it has to be a biopsy? Yeah, we're not doing muscle biopsies. No. I didn't think so. You covered you're going to come back to us on how is creatine synthetically made and from what. That would be cool to know. We covered the water retention, and if you've found any other information on that, that would be good. What about, I have heard more recently, a bit like protein, like the old 20 grams of dose was enough for protein, but actually they then realized that there is a little bit of body size component to this and total protein. So is there, like, I'm 80 odd kilos, there's a 50 kilo athlete, like, is 5 grams enough for me versus 5 grams for the 50 kilo athlete? And should it actually be dose dependent based on body weight?
Yeah. So I have seen some research suggesting larger doses up to 8 grams for larger athletes. I haven't actually seen a study showing like one dose and the impact on intramuscular levels over a size range, but I definitely have seen that recommendation that the maintenance dose needs to be closer to 8 grams for larger individuals. I don't know what that division is for larger individuals. And then I mentioned this briefly, but I think it's also important to mention that, or to reiterate that if you're looking specifically for the brain benefits, that suggested maintenance dose goes to 5 to 10 grams because creatine does cross the blood-brain barrier, but not as readily as some things. So we need to take larger doses in order to increase brain concentrations.
Is it like most vitamins where if you have too much in your system, it just gets expelled? Is there a problem if I'm a larger athlete? I like the way you said that. But if I take 8 and I really only needed 6, what happens to the extra? Does it just get excreted?
I think you'd see your creatinine levels go up even more.
And
So yes, excreted, metabolized. I haven't seen research showing a negative effect of taking up to 20 grams a day for extended periods of time. I want to say it was like a 16-week study.
It was a 12-month study with 20 grams a day.
Even longer. So no negative impact from taking that size of a dose over long term. So I think simply increasing from 5 to 8 grams, you're good.
Okay, that's good. I remember when I first started, when we were like 17, taking creatine for rugby, we were told to drink it with grapefruit juice. Is that still a recommendation?
So I'm curious about the grapefruit juice specifically. I mean, definitely the carbohydrates, because it increases creatine absorption in and of itself. The grapefruit juice is an interesting one just because grapefruit can block certain drug metabolizing proteins in our gut. That's why often if you're on different pharmaceuticals, you might not be able to eat grapefruit or drink grapefruit juice. So I'm curious if there's any connection there, but I don't know if there is specifically, but definitely taking with carbohydrates improves the absorption of not just the creatine, but of the carbohydrates also.
Good to know. I hated taking it with grapefruit juice, so I stopped that. What was it? Creatinine in relationship to creatine monohydrate. You've gone over that. Postmenopausal women intake. Did you touch on, again, dosage should just be 5 grams a day? Yep, cool. Jenny, I think we answered your question just then with you've got a race in 6 weeks. You just take 5 grams a day based on what Shannon was saying.
Yeah, start now.
What about if you were to increase it to like 10 grams a day for say 2 weeks? Will that help?
Yeah, I mean, it would help you see the benefit sooner. I would recommend splitting that 10-gram dose into 2 5-gram doses separated by like 4 hours.
Okay.
Jenny, I guess, given that you've got time and maybe a sensitive stomach, I would stick to 5 grams a day. That's what I would do. But anyway, you do what you want. No, that's fair enough. Pre or post training, I think that's been answered, Carrie. We're good with that. Doesn't really matter, but possibly post training with protein and carbohydrates could improve glycogen resynthesis and replenishment. 5 grams is a teaspoon, but most packets, I imagine, Gnarly comes with a scoop that is 5 grams.
Yep.
Yep. So most companies, a reputable company, will have a spoon or a scoop that is actually the weight. It is always interesting to check the weight of a supplement scoop. I might be neurotic, but I do it all the time at first, just to check that things are actually what they are on the label. And it's amazing when not so great companies tell you a completely wrong dose. So,
well, they bargain, they'll say, oh, there's 30 servings, but if you're just doing their scoop and their scoop is larger, like they never told you their scoop was 1 serving. You just assumed because they put it in there, and then you have to buy more product. So
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah.
I said, like, if I've been taking it for 15 years, should I be increasing my amount? Do you think? Like, I don't feel any benefit necessarily from it, but I've never come off it again. So I don't know, and I don't want to come off it. So, like, should I just stay on the 5 grams a day? Is that what
Yeah, I would say. We could do a muscle biopsy, Scott.
Good.
Yeah.
That could be fun.
I could do that. It could be interesting. Maybe I'll see about it. Just a big 15 gauge needle. Multiple sclerosis and creatine. I have heard, and this may be in relation to the brain, the content in the brain, but I have heard quite large doses of creatine can help MS. Is that correct? Or is that still sort of exploratory science?
I think it's exploratory. I have, I'm pulling up a paper right now to see if, yeah, the paper
The
that
reason I asked that while you're finding that is because we had an individual who was associated with our America's Cup team, who unfortunately was diagnosed with MS, and he started taking 20 grams a day, and it dramatically changed his motor function. Like, it was crazy, and there was no, like, I don't know if it could be placebo, but he swore by it.
So do you think it was, the paper that I was thinking of doesn't talk about MS specifically. Do you think it was more, right? Because I don't know a ton about MS, but it's to do with myelination, in the brain. Do you think it was more to do with the motor side of things, and it was a benefit from muscular?
It helped motor. It helped his motor. Like, he had a traffic light system for good day, bad day. And it just went, and his good days were based on how he performed, how he could walk, how he could function. And it was dramatic in terms of green lights. Like, it was crazy. So, but yeah, I thought you might have that. You covered, I think, 10 grams you were saying for crossing over the blood-brain barrier. Is that correct? Assisting with cognition.
Yep.
8 to 10 grams, you said?
Yeah.
Yep. Then Brett had a reduce. So something I have heard athletes say they may attribute some GI distress to creatine, which I think is quite uncommon. But if someone eliminates everything else from their diet and they are taking creatine, is there any benefit in splitting that 5 gram dose into, say, 2.5 gram doses?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't worked specifically with any athletes that have had GI distress, and so I haven't tried that, but I think it's worth trying it. It's also worth looking at the creatine that you're currently purchasing, making sure it's third-party tested.
Making sure it's creatine.
Yeah. Because potentially it might not be the creatine specifically. It could be that the product's contaminated with something else.
That's a very good point. Very good point. You mentioned inflammatory markers. I'm always interested in this, just with chronic athletes, and that. Are we talking like IL-6, HS-CRP, anything else?
IL-6 and CRP. I don't remember any of the other ones, but those are the ones.
That's all right. It'd be cool. Just I know they're not always. I don't think we routinely ask athletes to get them, but I know some of the higher performing athletes get those particular markers tested. Maybe we should be asking for all athletes to get it, because it would be super cool just to see if markers like that change over time anyway, based on improvements in daily or habitual nutrition with their fruit and vegetable intake and better protein and maybe creatine on top. But okay, that's cool. Sensitive stomachs, I think we touched on that. John, are you happy with that? Touching on like difficult stomachs and maybe splitting the dose if you do have it. Brian, best form, or Shannon, best form of creatine to buy is?
Creatine monohydrate.
There we go. And I think just on that though, Brian, is Creapure. Look for Creapure in your products, and Gnarly sells it, and so do True Protein. They're two reputable companies that I would certainly say buy your products from, because they are tested and looking for that stamp of approval, like NSF Sport or Informed Sport or HASTA. It means that the products are tested, and whatever they're telling you on the label, that's what the product is, and it doesn't have banned substances. So it eliminates the chance of it won't 100% eliminate, but it does significantly reduce the possibilities of a contaminated product. And then Margaret, I think your question was my question about 5 grams difference for a 100-pound woman versus a 170-pound man. It seems to be. Keep doing that, but maybe some increased doses. And if we can find some information on that, we'll share that.
Perfect. Thanks.
That's all the questions. That's all.
Such great questions.
This was just fascinating. So fun to have you on. Thank you for sharing your time and expertise with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, and thanks for the great questions. I mean, I think the back and forth between, you know, someone that's presenting and the audience is that's what I like the most. You know, you guys have learned something and are interested, and yeah, so thank you for being such a great audience. I appreciate it.
All right. Well, we've got collagen to cover. We've got a whole bunch of other stuff. So you guys will be seeing Shannon again.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you, Shannon. It was fantastic. Really enjoyed that. So learned a lot.
Thanks so much, guys. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.
Take
We'll
care,
see you soon.